We're fortunate to have a member in our club who's, with his international connections, has again persuaded a friend, a very popular Prime Minister of the Netherlands, to give us his views about how others see us. To introduce today's speaker, please welcome Bill Franklin.
After Andreas van Agt received his doctorate from the Netherlands Catholic University, he practiced law and later became a professor of criminal law at his alma mater. At age 30, he entered government service, where he worked in several ministries until he became Minister of Justice at age 40, eventually serving as Prime Minister in 3 different governments. In the 1980s and 1990s, he was the European Union ambassador to both Japan and America. His bio says he's fond of cycling. Perhaps that's a huge understatement. 2 years ago, he and a friend of his, just 2 of them, took off one morning from Amsterdam and cycled all the way to Moscow, more than 2,000 miles. An impressive career of public service, but after knowing this gentleman for 20 years, I think I'm more impressed by his personal integrity, his humility, and his good humor. I'm an amateur student of politics, so one night at dinner at my Tokyo home, I said to Andreas, "How did you become Prime Minister?" He said, "Oh, big accident." And I said, "But you were Prime Minister again." "Oh, second big accident." That's as much as he wanted to tell us. And it's not his nature to tell other countries how to manage their affairs, so it took some persuading to get him to speak here today. In fact, he was scheduled to come here a year ago, but his government called him back to head up a commission on anti-terrorism, so he had to postpone. He's a straight-talking man. I believe it is best when good friends are candid and straightforward with each other. I hope he will be that way with us today. Please welcome our good friend of America, Andreas van Agt.
Thank you, first of all, dear Bill, for such a wonderful introduction that certainly has raised expectations above what I really am able to offer. And thank you also, my dear neighbor at the luncheon table, for speaking this wonderful French. The question I have to deal with is assigned to me, how do you see us? That's very delicate. It is, I should say right away, that I'm fully aware of how critical many Americans are, rightly, wrongly, are of Europe. The continent I'm coming from stands in bad repute on this side of the Atlantic. I know that. A researcher at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, author of a book titled Evolution of the Transatlantic Relationship, presented recently a graphic description of how our relationship went sour. He writes, watch Fox News on TV. Read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. listen to American radio talk shows. And it all becomes clear. Europe is America's rival and is going to the dogs. He then observes what he calls a groundswell of annoyance and pessimism in the US about Europe. Europe is seen, in his words, but he may be right, Europe is seen as decadent, complacent, lazy, and perhaps most damning of all, increasingly irrelevant. Now, tackling the question, what has Europe done to draw America's scorn and contempt? The author mentioned as the main reason that in the perception of many Americans, Europe has proven to be an untrustworthy ally in America's hour of need. Most Americans, so the reasoning goes, consider the so-called war on terror as payback time. After twice saving Europe from itself in world wars last century, and then sheltering it under America's nuclear umbrella during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, Europe's full backing was taken for granted when the US itself came under attack. So lackluster support and growing criticism in Europe of Washington's response to 9/11 were considered as little less than a betrayal. Responses to 9/11 have been America's strategic litmus test. And most European so-called allies are deemed to have failed miserably. Only Britain and Poland, and a little bit the Netherlands, I would say, proved themselves to be good apples in a rotten barrel. Now, so much for this brief scouting operation into present-day American thinking on Europe. I told you this to show that we Europeans are well aware of your being pointedly critical of us. And that is by itself a partial answer to your question, how do Europeans see us now? Well, we see you as loath of us. Moreover, this focus on your anger with criticisms from Europe readily leads me to an analysis of these criticisms and how they were evoked by US policies. When presidents are inaugurated, no matter where in this world, they all succumb to the temptation to extol their country, its great history and superb achievements. And President George W. Bush was no exception. When he was installed by the end of January 2001, installed for the first time, his inaugural address was full of American self-glorification. A compatriot of yours, an American professor, referred to that address while lecturing in Holland on the theme of what he, the lecturer, the American, called American exceptionalism. The US, he argued, considers itself a city high on the hill, a beacon for all around, as of the foundation of the Republic. The dominant self-image has been the sense of being a great nation, called upon by divine inspiration to lead the world to an enhanced respect for personal freedom. Pursuing this calling, America may not be impeded by obstacles such as international law. The presumption prevails, the assumption I should say, the assumption prevails that the concept of human rights, although inspired by European philosophers, notably French, that concept of human rights has grown and matured in America and is to be proliferated in the world from here. International legislation is not accepted by the US unless and in as much as it does not encroach on America's own laws and policy. It is this notion of American exceptionalism that all too often keeps America from conforming to or complying with multilateral arrangements, treaties and their likes, which it cannot sufficiently control. There is ample evidence of American distaste of international institutions and arrangements. A telling example is, of course, America's reluctance to pay its dues to the United Nations. Highly regrettable is the fact that the United States has turned its back to or distanced itself from an array of international agreements, some of which are markedly important. Let me mention a few examples. Well known, yes indeed, is the rejection of the Kyoto Protocol on global warming and climate change. Maybe less well known is, but very important, again, is America's no against the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty on nuclear weaponry, a treaty made in order to stem the ongoing nuclear arms race in the world. When you prohibit testing nuclear arms by whomsoever, then of course you put a brake on the advancement of the technology. Now that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has been rejected by the United States and of course predictably in its wake then by others, saying, yeah, when America doesn't join, we won't do that either. A similar fate hit a protocol, also having the status of a treaty, by the way, a protocol aimed at instituting an effective control system regarding the compliance of the convention banning biological weapons. Convention against biological weapons. Why not? Because America did not want international inspectors to come over and control factories here. which of course was part of the system. Back and forth. The US did not go along with the creation of an international ban on landmines. The US did not want to join an international agreement to reduce small arms trade. Look, it is quite a list. But there's one more question that I would like to put before you. And I did that earlier on for other audiences, but it's important enough to do it here as well. That is the establishment of the International Criminal Court. 9 years ago, a diplomatic conference convened in Rome to discuss a draft for such a treaty on International Criminal Court, a draft made by an American international law professor, by the way. Now, what was the outcome? Almost 120 states present at the conference voted in favor of the end result of the negotiations at that conference. There were some 21 abstentions, and there were only 7 naysayers. Who were the no's? From whom? The no's came from the United States, China, Israel, and a few small islands in the Pacific that cannot survive without American lasting economic support. Colonies, in fact, that means. That is a very deplorable decision we feel, most of us in Europe do feel. The International Criminal Court is tasked with passing judgment on the most heinous crimes conceivable. It's about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Now, why does America refuse to ratify this treaty? Because there is no guarantee that never ever American military men or political leaders will be indicted before that court. That's the reason. So what's good for everyone is not good for America. American exceptionalism. How much time left, dear Bill? 3? Ooh. No, then I should cry out something. I say, dear friend, what has happened to dear America? That great country that immediately after World War II took the initiative to set up a completely new world order. You were the initiator of the new world order. And you still deserve to be praised for that. But follow it up, please. Without America, the United Nations would not have come into being. Nor the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank. The Declaration of Human Rights, a United Nations product, effectively. And the 2 follow-up conventions dating back to 1966. Very important documents of international law. They, to a large extent, fathered by the United States. And what about the Geneva Conventions of 1949 on international humanitarian law in times of war, which you have been violating time and again in Iraq? And other blocks, building blocks of international law that all came into existence largely due to, yes, due to, I want to my last words should be brimming with praises. So there we go. It all happened, all these achievements are to be ascribed to American idealism and perseverance. So I implore you, dear America, turn back to yourselves. Thank you very much.
We'll have questions, and each of these people have mics, and so you won't have to repeat it,
Okay.
and they will say it good, and you'll also get on the television. And we have 4 minutes, so lots of time. I just told them, we sort of cut them off short on the one hand because I knew that you would have questions, and so we have some time for questions now. If you have one, raise your hand. Got one back there. Go back there, Todd. And anybody else have a question they would like to ask? Bill's got one. You got to wait for a microphone, though, because we're getting some of these things. Here's our first question right over here that Craig has.
Not so much a question, but just a comment. Your description of somebody that watches Fox and radio talk shows, the opinion that you expressed of many Americans of Europe, I certainly don't share that. I was looking around, if you were to look at the value of the euro against the dollar, for just as one example, Europe certainly isn't irrelevant, and I think many of us are doing things such as reading The Economist, and I think many of us have more of a worldview, and so just my thoughts about my feelings about Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for restoring my optimism.
Lou Lundquist from the center of the room.
What advice do you have for your own countrymen and the rest of Europe in combating the aggressive movement of the Muslims as exemplified by the assassination of Theo van Gogh and the persecution of Iran Hirsi Ali?
Yeah, my friend, I was afraid that question would be put before me for one reason only. Since this cannot be answered in 1 minute. I'm honored that honestly, that's impossible. The whole thing is all too complex. You know, my problems start already how I hear you are wording your question. The Muslims. That ruffles my feathers already. The Muslims, that's an abstraction. The problem we have, you had, of course, 9/11 was the problem of problems at most. Europe later in Madrid, some hundreds of casualties. And then in London, very many casualties. Yeah, not 3,000 like in New York, but anyway, very many casualties, very many. And then some foiled attempts at criminal acts in Italy and in Germany. Let us not forget, this is about a very small number of people, a fringe of criminals and idiots, super radicals, that should not be mixed up with the majority of all people that are adherents of the Muslim faith.
He says, one more question.
Well, I listen to Fox News, and occasionally I listen to talk radio, but not all the time. But my question is, would you let me come to your Rotary Club and give you an answer to, let me speak to your Rotary Club and tell you what I think is wrong with
Invitation here. The invitation is here. Please come,
I'll be there.
and I'll pay your airfare.
He's a retired Secretary of State in the state of Washington,
yeah,
but just came back from polio plus in Africa. So he's giving you a bad
I gave you the ticket right now.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us, Andreas. Just think, he's came all the way to Seattle just to share his observations about how others see us, Americans. It's important for us to sort of get a feel for it. I had a little problem as I was listening to him because I thought, well, wait a minute, I don't know necessarily what goes on in Washington, D.C. is expressing how I feel about others, but nevertheless, this is what we're stuck with. So I guess we're going to have to get Ralph to go over there and fight it out for us. All right. Next week at the Sheraton, we'll hear from former Microsoft executive Bob Herbold about whether the U.S. will continue to be a global industrial leader. And during our short program, we'll recognize Veterans Day. Looking forward to sharing fellowship with you next week. We're adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health,